All right, thanks a lot, Mark. It is amazing to be here. And it was surprisingly good remembering how it was to like drive or be on trains in Germany. The train system here is all right, I guess. Switzerland, different league, but okay, that's not. Anyway, I'm not here to talk about trains today. I'm here to talk about JavaScript. Because oftentimes, it seems to me, as someone on the Google side of things, that SEOs like look for clues that allow them to blame things they're seeing on JavaScript, and then they show up, or someone from their team shows up on my in my inbox or on my social media, and it's just like, we found a bug, it's JavaScript. You say JavaScript works in Google search, but we have a strong hint that it doesn't, and it's because of JavaScript. And have you considered that maybe it isn't? Because most of the times it isn't. I get these like hundreds of times per year, and so far, year to date, there was exactly one problem that was presented to me as a JavaScript problem that actually was a JavaScript problem. And not only that, it was actually a bug in our web rendering service, and Mark is the person who found it. So good job. Well done, well done. You got the one that actually was JavaScript, so that's pretty cool. But I want to give you a glimpse of or into the things that I usually get presented with as a JavaScript problem that turns out not to actually be a JavaScript problem. So let's have a look. First things first, I once had this chat with Jamie Indigo. I think it was on SEO myth busting, where she asked me, is JavaScript the devil? To which I say, it depends. And what does it depend on? Well, if it actually is a JavaScript problem, and if you're using it wrong, then yes, it can actually hurt your website and your users. So JavaScript can be used for terrible, terrible things, but JavaScript gives you superpowers, and with superpowers comes big responsibility. So it's not always just JavaScript to blame. Sometimes it's those who use it, those who wield the weapon. If you are not sure if something is a JavaScript problem, then the very first stop should be Google Search Console, where you can inspect the URL, you can test the live URL, you can see what we saw when we crawled the page and indexed it or didn't index it. And then in there you have the HTML, and that HTML isn't just what your server sends, it is what we got after rendering. So when your content is there and the HTML looks like what you expect it to look like, and there's like a little search, I know I'm not supposed to run here, but I'm doing it anyway. So if you like use the little search button, or if you want to copy it and paste it into your code editor of choice, to then look into it further, you can do that as well. But basically use that rendered HTML as your source of truth. That's what Google search sees when it comes to this URL. And whatever is there, and we're going to look at it. So if there's like something that tells us not to index something, or if there's content missing, then we are not seeing it. All right. There's also more info that gives you more info. That is very, very helpful, like what happened in JavaScript console messages, what happened in the network. So that's your first stop. And if your content is there, and it's what you expect it to be, and it's very likely not going to be JavaScript that is causing the problem. And that, if people were doing that, just that, which I think is very basic, but, if people were doing that, 90% of the people showing up in my inbox would not show up in my inbox, because that's what I do, and I use also the rich results test because I don't necessarily get access to no one gives me access to the Search Console accounts. I wonder why. But okay, and you can use the view rendered HTML here as well, and you get the same idea. And usually that's exactly where our interaction stops, because I basically just go like, and then that solves the problem, so apparently. But sometimes, people come with problems, and here they tell me, well, I did that, Martin, and the problem is that the browser sees all the beautiful cats we have on our website, but for some reason, Google doesn't. And I'm not showing the HTML. In this case, I'm actually using screenshots, but you should have looked at the HTML, really. And in this case, you look at the HTML and you see like, okay, no cats whatsoever, so what is happening here? And if you look at it and people tell you, oh, this is a client-side rendered application, then clearly JavaScript must be the problem here. because all these cats are actually being loaded with JavaScript. So I must be lying because I tell people it works. If you use client-side rendering, it's fine for Google search, but clearly it is not. So it must be a JavaScript problem and it must be a Google problem. Maybe it's even a bug in Google. That's actually surprisingly many of the people who end up in my inbox suspect it is a Google bug. And I'm like, really? Your website that is like a store for very specific products in a very specific place is affected by a bug that is in Google and does not affect any of the other websites out there. That's interesting. It happens sometimes. Mark was one of those cases. But like most of the time, it's not us, it's you. So let's have a look. Haha. Oh, what does my eye see here? JavaScript console messages. There's a message there. Well, case closed. It's JavaScript. Especially if you look at it like, oh, there's an error. Oh my God, unexpected end of JSON input. Ooh. So messages in there, in the JavaScript console, even error messages, don't necessarily mean that that is the culprit, right? It can be like some optional component. It can be something that does not influence the content on the page, throwing errors here. So just the presence of a JavaScript error here does not mean that there is a problem. Interestingly enough, it said like end of JSON input. So now if you look at the application later on, you see that JSON is the format that they use to transfer the list of cats that then actually triggers additional requests for loading the actual pictures of the cats and all that kind of stuff. So it is a bit weird, but that does sound like a backend problem. And I'm not sure what the problem with the backend is. So let's go back to more info and actually go to page resources. And we notice that there's one that couldn't be loaded. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a problem. If this is like a tracker, like an analytics tracker or something, then whatever. If this is a web font, who cares? Like a lot of stuff cannot be loaded and doesn't matter really for Google because what font your text is in doesn't really matter to us, for instance. So, but let's see what hasn't been loaded. Oh, look at that. The API hasn't been loaded. And look at why it hasn't been loaded. Googlebot blocked by robots.txt. Now, if you were to block your product detail pages from Googlebot by using robots.txt, be it JavaScript or not JavaScript, what would happen? Good things or bad things? Probably not what you want, right? So that's exactly what happened here. Someone tried to be clever, was like, oh, we're wasting crawl budget on the API. No, the API is what actually builds the page. So the content comes from the API. So if you're blocking Googlebot, what actually happens is that we can't make an API call. We cannot get the cats from the server. And then we get like this gnarly message here. And then we get sadness. All right, I want cats, and I get sadness. I get an empty page. And that's what happens here, and it's not the JavaScript. The JavaScript is just experiencing a problem because something couldn't be fetched from your server, and that's because someone tried to be clever when they very clearly were not. All right? So do not block any critical resources, and that includes API calls that are necessary to load content, because bots, like Googlebot, actually have to fetch these to see the content that they are providing to the page. So if you are blocking things in robots.txt, that's not a JavaScript problem. That is a you problem. I'm very sorry. All right? I mean, if you block things that you want to block in robots.txt, good job. Well done. Bless your heart. But here in this case, not great. Not fantastic. OK, but then, you know, we have other cases. And Mark might listen up here. Noindex detected in robots meta tag, which was pretty much what he discovered. But in that case, in his case, we fucked up. So here we have a website that is not showing up in the index, and it clearly should. Mark, can I tell the story of what happened there? It was quite interesting. I don't have slides for that, but I find it quite interesting. And now that I see his face, it reminds me of like, anyway, what happened there is that fundamentally he noticed that pages showed up in the index that were no indexed, and out of the blue, they started being indexed. And he's like, huh? Did we remove the no index? No, the no index is here. I don't understand the problem. And the Noindex was added with JavaScript, which I wrote the documentation for that it's fine. And it was fine. Back in the days when I came in 2018, it was fine. 2019, when I checked the last time, it was still fine. At some point, I lost interest because it clearly works. In, what was it, July, it stopped working. And I debugged it, and I'm like, you know, from experience, I'm like, let's see where they screwed up this time. They didn't. We did. And I asked the rendering team to figure out what was going on there, and we traced it, and we found out that there was a function that we use that was supposed to do one thing, completely unrelated to robots meta tags, but also happened on the way to kind of pass by the drive-in for robots information and kind of like got that in as well. So by the roadside, we picked up robots information in that function as well. But the function basically says something completely different, and I could probably say what the function was called. It was called get redirect info. So the function's purpose was to figure out if this page redirected and get information on the redirect chain. As part of that, it kind of accidentally also got, well, not accidentally, but like it also additionally got information if something on the road there, be it a redirect or the actual original page if there were no redirects, is roboted, or we have something that says no index. Okay, cool. But then some engineer came in and said, like, this function is really slow and the code is really clunky. We need to clean this up. Good initiative. I like that. But then you don't see the whole picture. You look at this piece of code in isolation. It says, like, get redirect info. So what this function needs to do is get redirect information. So it refactored it, they rewrote the code, made it very elegant, very fast, very nice. But also it only did what it said it would do. It got redirect information. It stopped giving us the information about Noindex and nofollow and all these kind of things if they were added with JavaScript, because that was what this function kind of also picked up on. So now we had this function. We still got the data for those cases where it was in the initial HTML. We did no longer get the data for cases where JavaScript was involved. And that's why that mistake, this bug happened on our end. And we could fix it by just calling a slightly different function that also actually gives us the robot information, or calling an additional function that also gives us this information. And then we fixed it. So someone else goes like, haha, we have the same problem because we get a no index detected in robots meta tag when there is none, which is the opposite of the bug, but okay. Let's have a look. Oh, yeah. Oh, no. Oh, this must be us, because clearly there's no meta robots in here. Except, and I debugged this with them, and I'm like, okay, no, this might actually be us, because like they went to Search Console, and they saw in the rendered HTML there is no index, no robots, no index. But then while I was trying to debug what was happening, I was not seeing us picking it up either. Like the debugging that I used was like, there's no robots, no index. This is fine. This is safe. Except every now and then it did pick up a no index, and I'm like, what is this happen? What's happening on our end? Until eventually, in the browser, I reloaded the page a few times, and eventually, you know, after being like, what the hell happens here, I got this. Wait a minute. So I kept refreshing, and every roughly 10th time, sometimes 11 reloads, sometimes 9 reloads, but roughly every 10th time, I got a meta robots no index. I asked them, so do you have like any A/B testing running? Do you have anything that could sometimes add a no index here? No. Okay. Are you using like anything in between your server and the browser or the client? Because this is not just the browser, this is also affecting bots. No, not that I'm aware of. Okay. So I dug a little deeper, and I was like, this is weird, but it's clearly not a mistake on our end, because every now and then we do see a no index. And unfortunately, if that happens to be the next crawl, we would remove it from the index. Okay. And then I looked at what we got. So the browser, in this case, where we have a Noindex, gives me all this crap. And that's a lot of stuff. But I asked again, so what's your setup like? And they're like, well, we have like some sort of hosting, and then that's it. And I'm like, OK, that's interesting, because I'm sure about that. Because here, if I look closely, I see a few things. I see these headers are non-standard. The CF thing is something that is not standard. And I happen to know that this is Cloudflare. And sure enough, the server that actually serves me is Cloudflare. And I'm not saying this because I want to shit on Cloudflare. This could have happened with any other service that you might put in between your server and your users. Could be like your own proxy, your own cache, could be a firewall, could be another CDN provider. Cloudflare is actually one of the really nice ones that are usually very, very fast in fixing bugs if they have them. And we tell them there's a problem. There's others where they're like, who are you? And we're like, OK. And the interesting thing is that what I noticed is whenever, so I don't know how Cloudflare works internally. So whatever this is probably tells us where it's coming from in their infrastructure, because AMS sure does look like a very popular data center location, which is Amsterdam. And I noticed that whenever Amsterdam was involved in these CF ray values, or AMS, I'm guessing is Amsterdam, I don't know, then we actually did get a Noindex, and with everything else, we didn't. So sometimes I got other values there. I can't remember what they were, but like sometimes I get another value there with a different three-letter code at the end. And surprisingly then, I would not see a Noindex. And then I asked the person who runs the website again, so like, what are you doing? Are you using Cloudflare? And they're like, oh, yeah. I'm like, OK, cool. I asked 2 times if there's anything in between. But all right, Cloudflare works for me. That's fine. So could you purge their cache? Because they have an option to kind of delete whatever Cloudflare stores in between and make sure that it gets served fresh from their servers, because maybe on their servers it's fine, I don't know. And it turns out, yeah, it was fine on their servers. And actually, after they purged the cache, they no longer had the erroneous Noindex showing up. So again, what looked quite clearly as some sort of weird JavaScript glitch at first, because the rest of the website was like all JavaScript. I kind of faked the screenshot there. There was lots of JavaScript doing lots of funky things. But it turned out that in the end, it was just their CDN provider caching incorrectly, which can happen. That's fine, but it's not a JavaScript thing. So another thing that you should probably do whenever you're seeing really weird, funky things happening is you should compare between the moments where it doesn't happen and the moments where it does happen, what you get in these response headers, because that's the meta information that your server gives whenever you make or your browser makes a request. And sometimes you find interesting things in here that tell you like, oh, there's something weird going on. Here's a bunch of caching involved. In this case, we didn't load from a cache. I don't even know what this varnish cache is and where that comes from, but there's a bunch of stuff going on in this request, and it wasn't JavaScript in the end. OK. So we had that. But wait. Someone else came to me with a problem, and they said, haha, but this might be JavaScript, right? Because for some reason, our single-page application, our error pages, can sometimes show up in search results. I said, that's annoying. We have a thing called the software for detection, and we're trying to avoid this situation as good as we can. If you give us a very clear error message like this one, normally it doesn't slip through. Here, for some reason, it actually did slip through. You could consider that a bug on our end, but there's something fundamentally wrong with your website if that happens. So let's go to that URL. OK. Yeah, it looks very much like an error page, right? So what's happening there? So I opened the developer tools, and I looked at what happens on the network. And oops. That's a 200 OK from the server. That's a bit of a problem. If your website gives us a 200 OK for something that is an error page, as I said, we are trying to catch that. But really, you're not doing yourself any favors here. Your server should not be like, yes, this page exists, all good, when the page looks like that. That is not good. And that's something, unfortunately, that happens very quickly if your developers are holding it wrong a little bit. And I would not necessarily blame them for it because the tutorials normally on the documentation normally don't explain it. So if you build single-page applications, the biggest problem is that or developers believe, front-end developers specifically, believe that that's nice because you no longer have to configure much on the server. The server just always serves the index HTML file, and then the JavaScript works out the content. And how that looks is like this. So somewhere in the page, you make a network call to a URL that looks something like that. So we have like an api.martinscheese/cheese, and then the ID of the cheese that you're going to. So if you're like going to Martin's cheese/camembert, for instance, then it would make this specific call, like /cheese/camembert, and then it would wait for the response to come back. The second line doesn't matter that much. The third line is interesting because that's when the cheese information comes back. And then we look at, does this cheese exist? And if the API encounters something, if I go like LOL, OMG, WTF, BBQ, and then it would go like /cheese/that, then obviously I don't have a cheese that's called that, and this cheese doesn't exist. And if the cheese does not exist, that's the does not exist, then we show an error page. The problem is at that point, the server has already had to respond to something to serve us this HTML and JavaScript. And as the server is no longer part of what the developers consider to be important, they just said like, yeah, just serve the index HTML, whatever. So the HTTP 200 is already out, and we can't change that. It's the server response code. So the server has sent a response. It always sends a 200 OK response, and now we can't do much about it. But it doesn't really matter because the user sees the error message. We are fine, right? Except that for bots, this really isn't great because we now have to figure out, or we're now the ones who have to figure out that this is actually an error and not something that you would like us to see and put potentially in the index as well. And people tell me that that's why single-page applications or client-side rendering does not work for SEO. That's not true. It just doesn't work that way, but there is a solution, and it's a very simple solution. Configure one URL on the server that actually serves a 404 and just redirect to it. So now you have an actual full-blown, still looking the exact same error message and error page, but your server can actually serve a 404. And what we see in Google search is like, okay, so we're getting this page, oh, it redirects us to this other page, oh, that page is a 404. So then this page is a 404. There we go. End of story. Done. Problem solved. It's not the greatest way of doing that, but it's one way that definitely works and is absolutely fine from our perspective. And it's definitely better than serving us a 200 and then still showing an error message. So this is pretty good. And that means you can fix these kind of applications and you can fix these kind of problems pretty reasonably well. Which brings me to my summary. Yeah, sometimes it is JavaScript, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem that can't be solved. And actually here the solution to the problem that JavaScript brought upon us was JavaScript. Haha, all the irony. And actually if you're holding it right, it wouldn't have been a problem in the first place. And that's what I'm trying to combat. And I try to help with that by going to developer events as well and talk to developers about these things because they genuinely don't know. But that also means that there's a very good chance that your developers don't know something that you could potentially know by reading our documentation and using our tools. And you could teach them as well. It makes your life easier, it makes their life easier, it makes your users' lives easier, it makes everyone's lives easier. It's great. If you find something that does not work or doesn't work the way that you expected or that leaves you with questions with regards to JavaScript, talk to me. I'm very visible online. I'm also very visible here tonight. So please do come on, talk to me about it. I won't shame you. I won't yell at you. I didn't name any names of the people who gave me these wonderful examples involuntarily. And I genuinely want to make the JavaScript documentation better. And I keep hearing people saying like, oh, we need more documentation in this. And then I come back with a follow-up question like, what would you like documented that isn't documented right now? And they all go silent online for some reason. I'm not sure if I'm intimidating, is it the German? I don't know. I don't know if it's that, but I promise I'm a nice person and I'm very, very willing to help, but just tell me what is missing in our documentation. Speaking of that, please use the tools that we have. Check out the crawl page, check out the rendered HTML, check for more information in the more information tab. These things really, really do help, especially if you can compare the HTTP header. This actually also in more info for the page resources, it shows you the headers as well that you got from the server. And you can compare these to the ones that you do in the live URL test. And then you see, like, is this something that happened when it was last crawled? Because here the crawl was a few days ago, for instance. And maybe the developer fixed the problem in the meantime. You would see that in the live URL test. So please do use these tools. And with that, I think we're open for questions.